Hello and welcome back to another full step-by-step PC build guide, and today I've got a small form factor build for you in the latest case from Fractal Design, the Terra. Now, as well as being absolutely gorgeous, this case is really tiny in size. It's only 10.4 litres, and when you compare it to the GPU box that we're going to be using, it's even smaller. So we're going to have a bit of a job trying to fit all this into this, but that's where the fun comes in. So let's take a look at the other parts I'm going to be building with today. For the motherboard, I'm going to be using ASRock's B650E Phantom Gaming ITX Wi-Fi. For the CPU, I'm going to be using AMD's Ryzen 9, the 7900X. Keeping our CPU cool, I've got a low-profile air cooler from Noctua. It's the NHL12S. For RAM, I've got 32GB of Kingston Fury Beast DDR5 at 5200 megatransfers per second. For storage, I'm going with a single Gen 4 NVMe M.2 drive for this build, and it's from Adata and it's their Legend 960 in 1TB capacity. Powering the whole build, I've got a 750 watt Platinum SFX power supply from Seasonic. It's the SPX 750. For the graphics card, I'm going to be using the NVIDIA RTX 4070. And for the case fan, I'm going to be using an NFS12A from Noctua. Okay, that's all the parts, let's get building. So in terms of the aesthetics of the case, I think everything looks and feels really premium. So Fractal have used aluminium for the panels and it's up to 8mm thick. And on our front panel we've got some real walnut trim. In terms of our front I/O, we've got a power button and a single USB Type A and a single USB Type C connector. To remove our side panel, we first need to open the door from the bottom. It's just a matter of pulling it up towards the top. We've then got this little lever at the rear, so it's a matter of pushing it forward and that's going to free the rear side off the door. Once it's free, we can simply pull the door towards us and lift it away. And if we take a look at the back of the panel we just removed, you'll notice there's no dust filters, and in fact there's not a single dust filter in the whole case. It's exactly the same process to remove our other side panel. We just need to open the door up. Again, push this lever at the top towards the front of the case, free up the rear part of the panel, and then pull it off at the front. To remove our case's top panel, we've got this tab at the back, and all we need to do is pull it backwards to free up the top panel, and then it can be lifted away. In the bottom of the case, we've got our case accessory box. I'll show you what it contains later on. So this is everything that comes in our case accessory box. So we've got our screws individually packaged. We've got a cleaning cloth. We've got a bracket for mounting a 2.5-inch drive on the bottom of the case. And we've got some cable ties and Velcro cable straps. So the first thing I want to do is give you a quick orientation in the case. The case has a standard sandwich style layout with our motherboard and power supply on this side and our GPU going on the other side. In terms of motherboard support, it supports mini ITX motherboards. Our motherboard's going to go here. You can see we've got 4 standoffs. It's going to get installed upside down. The PCIe slot then is going to be at the top of the case, and we've got an included Gen 4 riser cable which is ready to plug in to the motherboard. In terms of our power supply, the case supports both SFX and SFXL power supplies up to a maximum length of 130mm. So if I set a standard SFX power supply into place, line it up with this removable bracket, you can see we've actually got quite a bit of space underneath the power supply. If you go with an SFXL power supply, it's going to come further down towards the bottom, and then that's going to affect what you can actually mount on the bottom beneath the power supply. Moving over to the other side of the case, you can see our GPU is going to be mounted in the vertical position here. We've got the riser cable here, and then the thumb screws to secure it. So taking a look in from the top of the case, you can see we've got this spine running down the middle of the case. We're going to mount our motherboard on this side and our GPU on this side. And this brings us on to one of this case's coolest features, and that is that this spine is movable. So what we can actually do is move it further down, making less space for our GPU, but making more space on the motherboard side, meaning we're going to be able to install a larger CPU cooler. Alternatively, what we can do is move the spine up the way, making less space on the motherboard side and giving us more space for a wider GPU. So to adjust the position of the middle spine, there's 4 screws we need to loosen, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom. And out of the box, they have these orange transport locks on them, which we need to remove. So I've just removed the orange transport lock. I'm going to put each of the screws back in loosely. So now with all the 4 screws loosened, the middle spine is movable. So we wanted to make more space for our CPU cooler. It's just a simple matter of pushing the spine down towards the bottom, and we push it right the way down to the bottom at all 4 sides. This is the position that gives us the maximum space for our CPU cooler, but also the least space for our GPU. So I just want to give you a quick look at what the case looks like with the spine in position 1, so the maximum space for your CPU cooler. So you can see the effect this has on the other side, and we've now quite limited space on the GPU side. If we wanted to make the most space for our GPU, it's just a matter of pulling this all the way towards the top. So I also want to give you a quick look at the case with the spine set to position 7, so we'll maximise the width for our GPU. And you can see here you're going to be able to fit a pretty beefy card in, although no matter which position you have the spine in, the length is going to be limited to 322mm. And again, giving you a quick look at the motherboard side of things in position 7, so you can see the space now is quite limited. Our power supply bracket is almost up against the edge of the case, and the maximum height for our CPU cooler is going to be limited to only 48mm. So we take a look over at one of these screws. You can see the different positions you can have this middle spine in are labelled from 1, where you've got the smallest space for your GPU, to 7, where you've got the most space for your GPU. And it's just a simple matter of sliding each of the screws into the position that you want them in, and then tightening the screw up to keep the spine in that position. Importantly as well, you're not limited to positions 1 to 7. If you want to have it halfway in between them, a quarter of the way in between two different stops, you can do that. So you can really tailor this case to get it in the perfect position for your hardware. So when you're trying to decide which position to put the movable spine in, this is the diagram in the manual that you're going to want to check. So you can see we've got the different spine positions from 1 to 7, and you can see the CPU clearance we have in each of these different positions. So the CPU clearance that we need is 70mm, so we can have the spine in 1 or 2, but if we put it into any of these other ones, our CPU cooler won't fit. The GPU width for each of the slots is in these 2 rows. Which of the rows you follow depends on the height of your GPU. If your GPU height is less than 131mm, follow the middle row, and if your GPU height is between 131 and 145mm, follow the bottom row. Our GPU height is less than 131, so it's this middle row that we're going to need to be able to follow. So in the first slot, our GPU width needs to be less than 43mm, which it is, and that's the reason I've picked this particular slot. If we wanted to get an extra 5mm of space, we could install it in the second position, and our CPU cooler would still fit. So if you are thinking of doing a build in this case, I would refer to this table to help you pick out your hardware. So I'm just going to push this all the way down towards position 1. And tighten up the 4 screws. So our power supply bracket is removable. There's 2 screws on the back which we need to remove. And then the bracket can simply be lifted away. I'm going to go ahead and attach our power supply to the removable bracket at this stage because there is one feature I want to show you while the case is empty. So we're just going to use 4 of these larger screws from the case accessory box. So if I go ahead and set our power supply into the case. So one of the concerns you might have about the placement of the power supply right up against your graphics card, particularly if your GPU has a flow-through style cooler on it, is that it may affect the airflow. So Fractal have thought about this, and there is a way that you can actually move your power supply further away from the GPU, making a bit of space for airflow. So we're going to make this space by installing standoffs from the case accessory bag into the back of the power supply. So it's just a matter of twisting them into place. So this one I was okay to insert by hand. This one now is completely stuck and I can't get it any further. Unfortunately, Fractal haven't included the standoff insertion and removal tool. And this is always a big no-no for me. If you're including standoffs that you expect somebody to put in and out to customize part of the build, you need to include the standoff insertion and removal tool. So Fractal, if you're listening, please add this in. So I've got one here from another case. I'm just going to pop it into place. And then this is going to let me use a screwdriver to insert the standoff. So in the case accessory box, you get 2 different sizes of standoffs. These are the 10mm standoffs. There is also these 6.5mm standoffs. So to decide which of them you need to use, you need to look at the diagram in the manual. So you can see here the height of the standoff that you're going to use depends on which slot you have the case in. So in slot 1 that we have it in, we use the 10mm standoff and we use that right up to slot 4. In slot 5 it's the 6.5mm standoff, And if you have it installed in position 6 or 7, you can't actually use this offset standoff. You're going to have to install the power supply in a standard position. So you can see now if we set our power supply into place and would simply just screw it in with the same 2 screws that we removed, we've now got a nice gap between the power supply and our graphics card, which should improve airflow. In terms of drive mounting locations, you can't mount any 3.5-inch drives in the case, but we do have 2 dedicated 2.5-inch drive mounting locations, one on the front and one at the bottom, and they both mount drives with slightly different mechanisms. So on the front, you're simply going to slot your drive in between these Velcro straps, and they're going to hold the drive in place. Obviously they are Velcro, so I've slotted it in, but you can of course open it up, put the drive into place, and then tighten up each of the straps to hold the drive in place. To install our 2.5-inch drive at the bottom, we're going to set the bracket that comes in the case accessory box onto the drive, and then we're going to use 4 of the screws with a little lip around the outside to secure the drive to the bracket. If we take a look at the bottom of our drive bracket, you notice we've got this little notch on it here, and we've also got a little notch here on the bottom of the case, so it's just a matter of sliding the drive bracket into that notch. And then if we take a look in from the underside of the case, there's a screw hole here, and then we're going to use one of the screws with the flat head on it to secure the drive in place. So there is only 2 slight issues with installing the 2.5-inch drive at the bottom. The first is if you go with an SFX-L power supply, it's not going to fit, although you are going to be okay with an SFX power supply like we have, because the power supply is going to sit here directly above the drive. The other issue is if you decide to go with a fan at the bottom, you can see the holes are here for mounting the fan. You're obviously not going to be able to install the drive at the bottom. So if you only want to install one 2.5-inch drive, I'd probably recommend the slot at the front. If you do want to go with 2, you're not going to be able to use an SFX-L power supply, and you're not going to be able to mount a fan at the bottom of the case. I'm not planning on installing the 2.5-inch drives for this build, so I'm going to go ahead and remove them. So our case has a removable GPU bracket, which makes installation a little bit easier outside the case. So the first thing to do is free up our riser cable, so it's just a matter of freeing it from the cutout at the top. And then we've got 2 thumb screws to remove. And there's also 1 screw on the rear of the case. So with all those screws removed, our GPU bracket should be able to simply be lifted up and removed from the case. Just before we get on to the build, I want to show you one more cooling option that the case does offer. So it is possible to mount a 120mm AIO, and it's going to go on the other side of the bracket from the power supply. So you can see the tubes here coming in the bottom. They come in through this gap, and the only way to get them in is to remove the front panel, which is held on with 3 screws at the bottom of the case. And also to get the front panel off, you're going to need to remove this screw, which holds the slidable spine to the top of the case. So you can see how the water block is going to get installed here on the motherboard. For me, I think this is an option most people are probably not going to go for 2 reasons. So we set our power supply back into place. You can see that the power supply is going to be blocking the radiator. So I think that is going to significantly affect the airflow coming through the radiator. But I think probably the bigger issue is it's going to really significantly limit your GPU support. So the maximum length you've got for a GPU with the IO installed here is only 200mm. So this is the smallest card I have. It's 215mm, and you can see with the IO installed, there's absolutely no way it's going to fit. Whereas without the IO, you can fit an absolutely massive graphics card up to 322mm in length. So probably not an option for everybody, but somebody will find this a useful option to have. To install our CPU, we need to push this lever down and out and then bring it all the way to the middle of the motherboard, and then we should be able to open the socket cover up. We can then set our CPU down into the socket, making sure the text is the correct way up, and there's notches at the top and the bottom that help line the CPU up in the right place. Once we're happy it's in the right place, we can close the socket cover down again, and then if we close this lever down, the black bit of plastic will pop off, and then we can pop it into the motherboard box for safekeeping. To install our M.2 SSD, we're going to need to remove the heatsink. It's held on with 2 screws. With the screws removed, we can lift the heatsink off. You can see the heatsink is connected with a fan cable up to our pump header on the motherboard. Next, we can insert our M.2 SSD into the socket. It's just a matter of wiggling it into place, and you'll notice when we flatten it down, the same screw that holds our heatsink in place is also going to hold our drive in place. If you're using the motherboard from new, there'll be some plastic protection on the back of the heatsink that you're going to need to remove. We're now ready to install our RAM, so we can open the clips on both slots. And then what we're going to want to do is line the RAM up with the slot. Once we're happy we've got everything lined up, it's just some firm pressure to the RAM and it's going to clip into place. And then exactly the same thing with our second stick. Get everything lined up, and once we're happy everything's lined up again, some firm pressure and it's going to clip into place. We're now ready to install our CPU cooler, and the first step is to remove these two brackets. They're each held on with 2 screws. And we'll just set these in the motherboard box for safekeeping. Next we've got one of these spacers to go over each corner. Then we've got one of these brackets to go at the top. And at the bottom. Then we can add some thermal paste to the centre of the CPU. There is some thermal paste included with the cooler. Then we can lower our CPU cooler down, lining it up with the bracket beneath. You'll notice we've got holes on the top of the CPU cooler, and that's designed to get your screwdriver down to secure the cooler to the bracket beneath. If you don't have a long screwdriver, one is included with the cooler. We then need to plug our fan cable into the CPU fan header, which is just here. And the other cable that I want to plug in is our EPS cable from our power supply. The reason I plug it in at this stage is once this is installed down the bottom of the case, it can be quite difficult to get the cable plugged in. And I found from previous experience it's easier to plug it in while the motherboard's on the table. So we can line it up with the header and push into place. Next we can insert our motherboard into the case, line it up with the standoffs beneath. And then we can screw the motherboard into place before the screws with the flat head from the case accessory box. Next thing to do is get our case cables plugged in. Our power switch is our only front panel connector and it's going to go into this header here. So make sure you plug it in to the right 2 pins on the header. Our USB 3.0 cable is going to go into this header here. So it's just a matter of lining things up and pushing into place. Then our USB Type-C cable is going to go into this header here. So it's just a matter of lining things up with the header and pushing into place. Next I want to install our case fan, so I've got it set to intake and I'm just going to slide it in at the bottom. We can then secure the fan into place with the 4 included fan screws that come with the case. We've got our motherboard's 1 and only system fan header here, so I'm just going to route our fan cable up to the header and get it plugged into place. So we're now ready to install our power supply, and I've gone ahead and plugged in the cables that we're going to need. So I plugged in our 24-pin cable and 2 8-pin PCIe cables. So the first thing I want to do before installing the power supply is get these cables routed the way we need them. We're also going to need to plug in our 8-pin EPS cable to the power supply, and also I want to plug in our 24-pin cable to the motherboard, because once the power supply is in place, access to the motherboard is going to be a wee bit more difficult. So the first thing I'm going to do is take our 2 8-pin PCIe cables and I'm going to pass them in underneath the power supply to the GPU compartment and pull them through. And then I'm going to take our 24-pin cable and get it plugged in to the motherboard. I'm then also going to want to take the 8-pin EPS cable that's already plugged into our motherboard and get it plugged into our power supply as well. What I then want to do is pull all our cables that are coming out of the power supply forward, and then I'm going to lower the power supply into place at the back. And then at the back of the case, we're going to be able to secure the power supply with the 2 screws we removed earlier on. We're ready to install the extension cable for our power supply. Another important step, make sure your power supply is turned on, and then we can go ahead and plug the extension cable into place. So with small form factor builds, I often find it's sometimes easier to cable manage as you go. And we've pretty much done everything we're going to need to do at this stage, so I do want to start managing some of these cables. So I think we have a nice space in between our power supply and our motherboard to get all these cables managed into. So we're now ready to install our GPU on the bracket. So the first thing to do is remove the thumb screws. And then we can open the clip on the slot. We can then take our graphics card and get it lined up with the riser cable. And once we're happy everything's lined up, it's just a little bit of firm pressure to the graphics card and it's going to clip into place. And then we're just going to insert the thumb screws again. We can then set our graphics card back into the case. It's just a matter of sliding things into place. The riser cable again I'm going to tuck in under this bracket, and then lower our graphics card down into position. We can then secure the graphics card into place with the screw at the back and the 2 thumb screws underneath the graphics card. We then need to install the riser cable into the motherboard, so we can open the slot on the motherboard, remove the plastic protection from the riser cable, and then it's just a matter of lining the riser cable up with the slot on the motherboard. And that feels like it's lined up. So once we're happy it's lined up, it's just some firm pressure and the riser cable is going to clip into place. So next we need to power our graphics card, and in the box for the graphics card we get this 12 volt high power adapter. We've got a 12 volt high power connector on this end and 2 8-pin PCIe cables on the other. So importantly, I have ran 2 separate 8-pin PCIe cables, and then all we're going to do is plug this in to the adapter. And then we can plug the other end of the cable into the graphics card. There we go, and we've got a nice satisfying click. So I think I'm just going to manage this cable over to this space here. So that's the build complete. If you don't know how to install Windows, the drivers, enter the BIOS, adjust the BIOS settings and update the BIOS, I've made another video that covers all of that, and I'll put a link to that video in the description. What I'm planning on doing now is some thermal testing, and then I'll be doing a full case review where I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on the brand new Fractal Terra and telling you whether I think this should be your next case or not. So hopefully you have enjoyed this build guide. If you have, please remember to give it a thumbs up. And if you're not currently subscribed to the channel, please hit the subscribe button as well. Thanks for watching.